Does Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida want to abandon decades of pacifism and make his country a true military power? The newly published 2023 Defense White Paper may provide some insights. Released after the Japanese government's approval of the new national security strategy last December, this white paper suggests that Japan is encountering, quote-unquote, the most severe and complex security environment since the end of World War II. But how much of that claim is fact and how much is a justification for hastening their military expansion? What are the potential impacts of a more assertive Japan for the region and beyond? Is Japan's deepening of its alliance with the U.S. and collaboration with other so-called like-minded countries going to produce a force for good, as it claims? I'm pleased to be joined for more discussion by Victor Gao, Chair Professor from Soochow University, Professor Anna Malindog-Uy, Vice President of External Affairs of the Asian Century Philippines Strategic Studies Institute, and from Moscow by Professor Anton, Fedyashin of the American University in Washington, D.C. So, Professor Malindog-Uy, let me go to you first. Now, the white paper is yearly, but the defense strategy is every 10 years. How important is this particular white paper? And what's the biggest difference between this latest defense strategy compared to the one published 10 years ago?
I think the defense paper of 2023 of Japan is very important precisely because this is where we can see what will be the trajectory and what will be the direction of the Japanese government when you talk about military and defense. And as you can see, I think the big difference between the last 10 years and this year is basically if you really read the defense paper, it's a synchronized and it's a mirror image of the national defense security of the United States. As you can see, it's singled out China and even Russia and North Korea as its so-called greatest strategic threat to its security, right, which is 10 years ago, I think it was not like that. So that's one. And I think in terms of impact, it's very telling that this means it may provoke what you call arms race in the Indo-Pacific region or the Asia-Pacific region, which I don't think Asian countries would like to see in the long run, because that is not good for the region and it may create some kind of military confrontation among countries. It depends on the situation, which is very volatile at the moment. So that's what I can see with this new 2023 Defense White Paper of the Japanese government.
Mm-hmm. Professor Fedyashin, what is your perception? Because as Professor Malindog-Uy pointed out, China and then the DPRK and Russia are singled out as the biggest threats to Japan. And the reason for Russia, for instance, is the war on Ukraine, and that the Ukraine was not prepared to face off any such invasion. Therefore, Japan needs not to experience the same lesson. Do you see such fears grounded in facts?
The grim realist in me, tells me that it was fairly unrealistic to expect Japan, a nation with that kind of economic and therefore potentially military clout, to really be a pacifist nation for too long. Does that mean that it's turned away from pacifism as good? No, it doesn't, but it is inevitable. It's just the reality of international affairs. The problem is the way that it's being done and how Japan is being co-opted into a specific bloc. If it were emerging as a great power with all of the military strength that attends this kind of emergence inevitably, and if it were balancing in its own region between different sides, that would be one thing. What's happening, unfortunately, is that it is being incorporated into a United States-led bloc, and no one can possibly have any doubts about it. We just had the Vilnius summit of NATO on the other side of the continent about a week ago, and although Ukraine was at the center of everyone's concern, there were 4 Indo-Pacific nations present there, Pacific nations, and they were Japan, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And NATO has already made it abundantly clear and done so publicly on numerous occasions that its long-term plan is to expand its influence into the Indo-Pacific region. And there's no secret about this. It always baffles me why the United States expects China to support the right of NATO to expand into Ukraine, despite all Russian concerns about this, when the same organization is already announcing plans to essentially expand in one way or another into the Indo-Pacific. And the fact that unfortunately Japan is becoming part of that expansion promises increased tensions in the Far East. And I have to tell you, if I were a Japanese politician, I would be looking for intelligent ways to balance in my region of the Pacific instead of joining the bloc. Because as Ukraine shows, this kind of bloc status, bloc diplomacy, results in violent overthrows of governments, civil wars, and then invasions. We'll see if the Japanese manage to find an intelligent, calibrated, balanced policy. But so far, unfortunately, they seem to be going in the other direction. Let's see what happens.
Professor Gao, what is your take on the question? Is Japan putting itself into greater danger by remarkably aligning with the United States in the security issues and singling out China as the current as unprecedented and the greatest strategic challenge, quote unquote? What is your take on all of the things that it listed about why China posed such a threat to Japan?
Well, first of all, when we look at Japan today, including the white paper and the defense strategy of Japan you mentioned, we cannot talk about it in a vacuum. We should connect this with what Japan did before 1945 and what Japan did when it surrendered unconditionally to several countries, including the United States, of course, but also China and the former USSR, and the pacifist constitution that it had been implementing since then. Therefore, for Japan to rearm, to try to push its political agenda through military means is absolutely the wrong thing to do. And it should not be tolerated and should not be allowed. Now, whether it is done by Japan itself on its own volition, or whether Japan was hijacked by the United States, for example, and increasingly binding Japan onto the bandwagon of the United States in pursuing the anti-China hostility, for example, that's another thing that all of us need to analyze very carefully. And also, whether the Japanese people who have been following the pacifist approach for decades now want to or have any interest in rearming themselves and try to make military adventures outside of Japan, that's also a very important question we need to ask. Anyway, I think the word of importance is that it will be absolutely against Japan's own fundamental national interest to become part of a bloc against other countries in this region, especially those countries which it surrendered to in 1945. Japan should never forget what it did when it unconditionally surrendered to China and to USSR, in addition to the United States, of course, in 1945. It should never forget the historical lesson that war for Japan is a dead end, and war for Japanese people will be a disaster in 1945, as well as whenever Japan wants to rearm and pursue its political goals through military means. Therefore, I appeal on the Japanese government to forget about rearming itself. It should use wisdom, diplomacy, negotiations to achieve its goal rather than becoming a military instrument played by another big country like the United States. Against whom? Against China and countries like Russia. This is a futile attempt in its nature. It will be completely disastrous for the Japanese people. if it is really implemented.
Professor Malindog-Uy, I want to get your reaction because the white paper really cites at least 8 aspects why China poses the greatest threat to Japan in terms of security, including what China does around its island province of Taiwan and what Chinese aircraft carriers are doing in the Pacific Ocean. What do you make of all of these? From the Chinese perspective, these are ridiculous claims because what China is doing to the province of Taiwan, how come it has to do with Japan? And let's not forget, as Mr. Gao pointed out, Japan colonized in a brutal rule of the island for 50 years.
Yeah, that's actually a very important point that you're saying. One thing first, before I comment on the mention of the Taiwan question in the white paper of the Japanese government, is first and foremost, this white paper signals as well that aside from the arms race that it may provoke in the Asia-Pacific region or the Indo-Pacific region, another thing it might create division among Asian countries, which is not good for Asia at the moment. Given that this century is what we call Asian century, meaning Asia is the center of economic development and prosperity. So that is not good for Asian countries. Second is it will escalate tensions in the Indo-Pacific region, which we see now, given the tensions in the South China Sea that is quite escalating because of interference coming from external powers like the United States. So with regard to the mention of Taiwan in the white paper of the Japanese government that was released recently, I see it as an over-the-top kind of thing on the part of Japan. And Taiwan is an internal affairs of, it's part of the internal affairs of China. It's a domestic affair of China. And we have to recognize the fact that if a country honors and respect what you call the one China policy, then they have also to be very true to their words by not interfering in the internal affairs of China. Because if you do that, then it creates a lot of tension and it will create a lot of problem. And I don't think China will blink an eye in trying to defend its integrity as a country. So for me, this is over the top, and I don't even agree. And I agree with Professor Gao that Japan should at least, rethink this kind of direction that they're taking.
We have to leave it there. Many thanks to Victor Gao, Anna Malindog-Uy, and Professor Anton Fedyashin.